Welcome to another exciting, explosive, and expletive-filled episode of What Happened, the show that fuckity fucks your mom's fuckity fuck. The early to mid-2000s were an interesting time for gaming, as there were still a ton of licensed titles based on TV shows and movies flooding the market, but not only that, there were games that just revolved around celebrities and weren't even necessarily based on an existing IP. I'm talking stuff like Apocalypse, Jackie Chan's Stuntmaster, Rise to Honor, The Wheelman, all classics through and through. At the end of the day though, there were none that quite matched up to the multiple video games based around the leader of the G-Unit, the man who represents change, the one, the only, Curtis 50 Cent Jackson. His video game career, which started with a massive bang, ended with a bit of a damp fart, with a crazy bumpy ride in between. So strap on your Kevlar and find the best scene in the club. It's time to find out what happened to 50 Cent Blood on the Sand.
That bitch took my skull.
As previously mentioned, Mr. Cent's first foray into the Digiverse kicked off with 2005's Bulletproof, a third-person shooter for the PS2 and Xbox, and a weird top-down PSP G-Unit edition that I really need to sit down with and just experience. Bulletproof wasn't quite GTA and wasn't quite RE4. It was an odd mix that featured a more open approach to level design, had NPCs like M and Dre, and a distinct lack of polish. It was developed by Genuine Games, who you'd be excused for not remembering, as the only other game they completed themselves was Fight Club, the only piece of media brave enough to seek the answer to the question, who was tougher, Abraham Lincoln or Fred Durst? It's Fred. Anyway, Bulletproof was praised for its voice acting style and accuracy to its source material, but took several shots to the dome when it came to the actual gameplay. Complaints ranged from wonky controls, unbalanced AI, and an uncooperative camera that many would describe as the wankiest of wankstas. In fact, the game's sole accolade was winning the prestigious Best Original Song at the 2005 Spike Video Game Awards, surpassing fellow nominees Mark Echo's Getting Up and Fantastic Four, but to me, they were all winners. Anyway, Bulletproof's publisher, Vivendi Universal Games, wasn't complaining though, because Bulletproof proved to be critic-proof at retail, selling over 1.3 million units across all formats. So, despite the press not thinking very highly of Fiddy's video game debut, Vivendi was in fact able to get rich without really trying. A year prior to Bulletproof, Vivendi had also published an obscure little FPS called Cold Winter. Yeah, hey, woo woo. Anyway, this had been developed by UK-based Swordfish Studios, who were already getting started on their next project under Vivendi. Now, since they were just the video game publishing arm of Universal Pictures, they excelled in nabbing licenses for just about everything, which led to the release of
Jesus Christ. That's Jason Bourne.
This license entailed more than just Bourne, as it also included other works by Robert Ludlum, including one for an in-development TV series based on the Covert One novels, which for the most part were published posthumously. Vivendi tasked Swordfish of developing a video game based on this, as of yet, unmade TV show, which wound up taking the form of a third-person tactical shooter taking place in the Middle East. The development of this Covert One project apparently ran smoothly throughout 2006 and early 2007, with the gameplay being fairly fleshed out and several levels having been built. The only thing they needed to fall into place was for the actual show to be picked up, which it never did. A made-for-TV movie based on the Hades Factor, the first Covert One novel, was released in 2006, but the hopes that would spin off into a regular serialized TV show were dashed, most likely due to budgetary concerns. This left Vivendi and Swordfish with a game based on not much, really. So, in a stroke of genius and/or madness, the higher-ups at Vivendi looked at the other IPs and brands that they did have the rights to, and well, can anyone guess where we're headed here? In an article published in the June 2017 issue of Edge magazine, many former Swordfish Studios staff spoke at length about the wild ride that was Blood on the Sands development. Former production director Ian Flatt recalled how they felt when they heard that their Covert 1 game was about to change. When we first heard, our jaws were on the floor. It was bizarre. We were an all-Caucasian group of Brummies. We never thought we'd get picked to do something like this. Of course, when you get thrown a curveball, you need to be able to adapt on the fly, and technical director David Percival explained how Swordfish did just that. In Covert 1, you were basically playing yourself. Now we had this celebrity we had to glorify, so the first thing we did was make a vertical slice level, something that had all the major gameplay elements, showed off the graphics, and so on. We wanted to keep that as small as possible so as to not push the team too much right away. We knew that we could iterate it later on. 50 Cent and his G-Unit chums needed to be impressed for them to sign off on what Vivendi was proposing, so they set out on building that small vertical slice level that would show off an explosive bit of gameplay to wow their new licensee. They knew that showing off an impressive next-gen model of Mr. Cent would pay off big time as well, so they made sure to nail the hell out of that. The biggest wrinkle in this plan was the game's setting. Covert 1's levels and assets were built around a Middle Eastern aesthetic, and it would take too much time and money to scrap everything and start over fresh, so the team had to come up with a cromulent reason for G-Unit to be halfway across the globe, blowing everything up. What they came up with was, unique. After performing a set and made up a stand, 50 Cent inquires about his monetary compensation. There's a disagreement. It's suggested that a diamond-encrusted skull would be a suitable replacement, but a villain appears and absconds with said skull. This results in 50 Cent asking, "Where's my skull?" for about the next 5 hours. The team were more or less taking the piss with this idea, knowing how ludicrous, how silly it all sounded, but it worked within the over-the-top style they were now aiming for. We had to make it less serious. We needed to lighten it up, bring some of our own humor into it, and be more tongue-in-cheek with gore and interactive takedowns and things like that. As it turns out, 50 Cent loved this whole direction, so the deal was officially signed and Swordfish got to work in earnest. Every few months, 50 Cent would be presented with a build that included new features or content to make sure everyone was on the same page, and many former Swordfish staffers described this process as pretty painless and professional, except for one particular instance. There was one milestone where our guys had to fly over to present the build to 50 Cent and his management team. He wanted his son, who was about 6 or 7 at the time, to be the person who would review the build and decide if it was any good. So he played it and was saying, I love this, it's great, but I want a level with helicopters in. Our guy explained it was a third-person shooter and didn't have helicopters in, but 50 Cent's son said, no, I want helicopters, and 50 Cent turned around and said, you heard him, make a level with helicopters in. So yeah, the team got straight to work. The problem was, just like Swordfish had explained, the game lacked the features and tech that would allow them to support vehicles. It just wasn't in their original design. And not only that, Fiddy also asked that car chase levels be included as well. This presented a number of problems for the team, as requests like these, this late into development, would require some serious work. Those interlude levels, where you're driving or being chased by bad guys and watching explosive set pieces around you, required a huge amount of AI and technology work. We had to get cars working and bumping into each other, make AI that would fight you while driving, create audio for engines and collision sounds. It required a huge amount of mechanics and work just for small sections of gameplay that were completely useless for the core shooter part. The helicopter level was even worse. We basically made it out of bits we had in the shoebox, and the designers stitched it all together themselves. There was no extra code work done for it at all. It was a pain to debug. At the end of the day though, since the chase levels culminated with this iconic moment right here,
Yo, 50, jump over that big ass ramp!
it was all worth it. In December of 2007, the project had roughly 4 months of development time left by Swordfish's estimations, but that's precisely when the next stumbling block presented itself. Activision were set to merge with Vivendi Universal, which eventually led to the creation of the Activision Blizzard we all know and love today. With this merger, a variety of different studios, IPs, and franchises were invited into the Activision Blizzard clubhouse, but unfortunately, Swordfish and SFIII's blood-soaked journey through the sand was not going to be one of them. When the merger was announced, Swordfish assumed for several months that Activision would eventually pick up Blood on the Sand, but Vivendi was no longer a thing, and thus Swordfish paid the team out of pocket, with no publisher officially backing them. I spoke to a former staff member who was at Swordfish during this time, who relayed to me that the studio's future wasn't all doom and gloom, as they had had conversations with Codemasters about being brought under their umbrella. It would just depend on how the situation with Activision would play out. It was therefore Bobby Kotick and friends who were ultimately in control of their fate, and if you've even watched one other episode of what happened, you know how precarious that position could be. Swordfish wanted to cover their bases though, so while they were polishing 50 Cent for release, management felt they could start putting together a new pitch to present to Activision if the opportunity came up. The source I spoke to was able to elaborate on this. There was a couple of months where we thought we would be kept on by Activision, and there was internal conversations about what a pitch for a new Wolverine game might look like. But then again, that might have only been a few weeks period. It was definitely after we had wrapped up on 50 Cent Blood on the Sand though, as we had time to do Wolverine research and mood boards. But I don't think it had much effect, as we got sold to Codemasters and we never even started a proper pitch deck or prototype. This waiting on Activision phase lasted for almost all of 2008, with the game essentially finished, until eventually Blood on the Sand was saved when the up-and-coming company known as THQ picked up the publishing rights. Once the game was out of Swordfish's hands, they were rebranded to Codemasters Birmingham, as per the deal I mentioned earlier. This was planned to happen well before the release of Blood on the Sand, and actually had nothing to do with its impending commercial failure. Speaking of which, Blood on the Sand was a commercial failure. Over the course of a bit less than 2 months, the game sold an estimated 56,000 copies in North America. This number was not, in fact, PIMP, but rather BOMB. The funny thing about this, though, is that the reviews for Blood on the Sand absolutely curb-stomp Bulletproof, with many websites appreciating the over-the-top style, solid shooting mechanics, and a banging soundtrack that featured exclusive songs recorded just for the game. As to why this sequel failed to even come close to the numbers of the first game, the source close to the project that I spoke to theorized with the following. Not to lay the blame at someone else's feet, but I think 50 Cent's popularity was not at the sky-high level it was when the first game came out. He was still well known, but no longer top of the charts like he was a couple of years previously when the game development had started. There is a bit of truth to that. SFIII's 2009 album, Before I Self-Destruct, which was released a few months after Blood on the Sand, debuted at number 5 in its first week and crawled its way to the RIAA's gold certification, indicating that it sold somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million copies. Nothing to sneeze at for, say, an up-and-coming artist, but a tremendous fall from grace from Get Rich or Die Trying's massive 12 million plus sales back in 2003. Video game competition also didn't help, as both Street Fighter IV and the GTA expansion, The Lost and the Damned, released just a few days before the blood hit the sand on February 20th. So while that covers the development of the game, there is one more matter we need to address. Back in September of 2021, a story surfaced which cited other ex-Swordfish dev, Darren Yemens, who stated that Blood on the Sand actually started life as a Tom Clancy game, but after looking into the matter more closely, closely, and speaking to my source, it seems this is simply not true. Ubisoft was the only publisher putting out Tom Clancy branded games and had been doing so with insane regularity since 1998. In addition, they eventually even purchased the Clancy name for the purposes of video game branding until the end of time, I guess. The Edge article I referenced earlier reached out to multiple staffers, and they only ever referenced the Robert Ludlum connection. Finally, my anonymous source shared their take. While working on the project, I only had people chat about the Covert 1 demos and plans that came before, never it being a Tom Clancy project. But I think some of the Tom Clancy games were talked about in relation to the tone of this game, military thriller with investigation and realism, so it might be that Darren got it mixed up. I worked with Darren, he was a friendly person to work with, but I think he misremembered after all those years. So with that, I think we can say it was probably just an honest mistake and call the matter settled. Tom Clancy and Robert Ludlum are in fact two different people. But if I'm being absolutely honest, Tom Clancy's 50 Cent cross Jason Bourne Blood on the Sand sounds like an absolute money idea. If you know of any other video game projects that got shot 9 times and lived, let me know in the comments below, holla at your boy on Twitter, or enter the candy shop that is the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate what's coming up. See you next time, and thanks for watching!